I've got kind of a simplified little piece of my network right here for you to look at. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is the fact that, well, first of all, I've got two switches. And these are great old switches. They work fantastically well. And everybody on my network plugs into them. So we usually use these red cables. I've got this laptop right here, so he's the only guy plugged in right now. Well, technically not the only guy. The other thing I have is a crossover cable here that interconnects the two switches. And then I have one of 4 different wireless access points that I use for wireless throughout my network plugged into these switches as well. All right, so this is my basic setup, but I got a problem. And the problem I have is that I have a lot of public people coming in and using my wireless network. I want them to. It's a good thing, okay? But the challenge is that I'm plugging my switches and my servers and everything into this one big broadcast domain. So a bad person could, in theory, via my wireless network, access file servers and things like that that I don't want them to have access to. Now, granted, I can put passwords onto servers and stuff like that, but I want to be a little bit more secure. So one of the things we can do is something we call a virtual LAN or a VLAN. A VLAN takes one big broadcast domain, because if you look at this, all my switches are interconnected. This is one huge broadcast domain, and breaks it up into 2 or more smaller broadcast domains. So it's kind of like taking a switch and kind of like cutting it in half. So we use VLANs all the time as a way to segregate our network into individual broadcast domains. Now, at first glance, when you hear this, you go, okay, Mike, that sounds nice, but why don't you just put all your wireless devices on one switch and then everybody else on another switch and divide them that way? Well, I can. There's nothing wrong with that. But keep in mind that in a big network, you get big banks of switches and they're kind of fixed in place, and to be arbitrarily pulling and yanking and maneuvering stuff around is a really bad idea. We need a way to separate broadcast domains electronically, and that's why we use VLANs as opposed to just bringing in more switches and making some, I could show you some messes I've seen over the years for people who don't. So the cool part about a VLAN is, well, you have to have switches that understand how to do this. So you basically have 2 types of switches in life. You've got unmanaged switches, which are usually very inexpensive. Those are the $10, $20 switches you can find. And then you have managed switches. Managed switches tend to be a lot more expensive because they can do cool things like, well, for one thing, VLANs. Now, in order for me to configure this, I've got to actually get into the switch somehow and do configuration. Now, switches by definition run at layer 2 of the OSI 7-layer model. They use MAC addresses. So we need to be able to get into this switch somehow. So what we typically do with switches is we give them, you ready, an IP address. Switches don't need an IP address to do their job. We just give them an IP address so we can open up a web page or a configuration or something so we can go in and configure the silly things. Now, on these particular switches that I have here, these come from Cisco. And Cisco provides a very cool tool called the Cisco Network Assistant, or CNA. Now, you download this from Cisco, and you plug in, and you punch into the IP address of the individual switches, and they have default IP addresses, so you can punch into them, and you can do the configuration. So the best way to start understanding VLANs is to go through the configuration process. I'm going to use good old Cisco CNA right now, and let's configure one of these switches for VLANs. Now, I have a copy of Cisco Network Assistant here on my computer, so what I'm going to do is actually connect to one of my switches right now. Now, I know the IP address for the switch because I configured it a long time ago. So I'm just going to type it in, hit OK, and these switches have usernames and passwords. And ta-da, I am now connected. In fact, it even sees another switch, which is kind of cool. In fact, this thing even says, I don't know if you saw that, but I've got an error that says, my fan is dead. So that's why we use these for demonstration as opposed to actually have them online and working for a living. I need to put a new fan into this particular switch. So in order to appreciate what's going on here, let's just go ahead and change the view. This is one of the cool things about the CNA is that it has this wonderful graphic. I can actually see all my switches, and I can even see which ports are plugged in right now. So this is plugged into the other switch here. This one is plugged into my laptop right now, and this is plugged into my wireless access point. This is kind of a cool little feature. Anyway, what we want to do is we want to set up some VLANs. Now, by default, and this is important, all switches are preset to use VLAN 1. Now you've got to be careful with this because on the Network Plus exam, they seem to think that the default VLAN is 0, and that's not really accurate. I'm not going to try to argue with CompTIA, but the default VLAN is VLAN number 1. So let's go ahead and get in here a little bit, and let's take a look. Now, right now I have exactly one VLAN. It's called VLAN 1. When you set up VLANs, you don't give them funny names like Timmy the Wonder Poodle. They're just called VLAN 1. The next one's VLAN 2. Sometimes you can call, if you want to, you can call it like VLAN 100, 101, whatever it is, but it's just a numeric value. All right, so here is my default VLAN. I'm going to add a new VLAN right now. So I'm just going to hit create, and I'm going to give it a very clever name like VLAN 2. And if I want to, I can give it a clever name if I wanted to, but I'm just going to leave it with the default name. And I've now set up a new VLAN. Now, once the VLAN's made, I now have to go through the process of saying who's going to be on that VLAN. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. So one of the ways we're going to do is we can come over to configure ports, and you can see a listing of all the ports. This is a 24-port switch, so all 24 are listed. This terminology you're seeing where it says FA0, that's basically Ciscoese for fast Ethernet. So it's FA0 and then number 1, 2, 3, 4 on down. So what I'm going to choose is I'm going to say that 5, 6, 7, and 8 are going to be assigned to VLAN 2. You can see right now they're assigned to VLAN 1. So I can just go right in here and set that to VLAN 2. So I've now set port number 5 to VLAN 2. And I can keep marching down and get the rest of these. Tell you what, just for brevity, we'll just do these first 3. Okay, now before we get out of here, there's something kind of cool I want you to see here. So we're looking at port number 7 of my little switch here. Now, I am setting it statically to VLAN 2. However, there's some other things you can do, and that's what this administrative mode is all about. So let me hit the pull down here. Static access means I'm going to physically assign what VLAN goes to each port. I'm going to come in here and set it physically. Dynamic access and dynamic desirable, which are actually the more common defaults, have to do with something called trunking. I'll explain that in just a second. Or we can force them into what we call a trunk mode. Let's talk about that for a minute. One of the things you need to appreciate about VLANs is that once I set a VLAN up, like that VLAN 2, it's not limited to one particular switch. We have protocols, like for example, Cisco has the proprietary VTP protocol, which will in essence tell this one switch to advertise to other switches that there's other VLANs out there. So if you take a look at my 2 switches, first of all, I've got them interconnected using this crossover. But I can start setting up VLANs with the same numbers as I have here on this switch. And because of VTP, VTP is not the only way to do it, but that's the Cisco way to do it, they will start talking to each other. So I can go into this switch and set certain ports up to be VLAN 2, and then these ports will be on the same VLAN as these ports. And this is all handled because of something called trunking. Trunking are ports that send all VLAN traffic. I don't care what VLAN it's on, trunk ports take care of everything. So anytime you're interconnecting 2 switches, those ports that are being plugged in are going to be trunk ports pretty much automatically. So most of the time when you're working on Cisco products, and other competitors have a similar thing, they'll invariably have a setting like we saw with this particular guy called dynamic desirable. Dynamic desirable basically means if you plug me into somebody, I'm going to listen to what kind of port he's plugged me into, and I'll act like him. So the moment we plugged these 2 guys in because they were preset to dynamic desirable, they suddenly realized they're going, hey man, we're a crossover, we can hear everybody's information, we're going to make ourselves to be into trunk ports, and they've done it automatically. So, and that's why these VLANs work, is because the trunk ports automatically work in that fashion. So trunking is really, really important, and invariably it's the interconnections between the switches are what become the trunk ports themselves. All right, let's go ahead and finish our configuration. Okay, so let's go ahead and complete the process here. So I'm going to have 5 through 8 on that top switch to be set to VLAN 2. So you can see I've got that set up now. Now, the important thing to appreciate is if I plug any device into these 4 ports right here, he's not going to hear anybody else other than devices that are plugged into one of the 3 other ports. So the VLAN has created a complete separation. It's as though I've got a little 4-port switch inside my big switch. With trunking kicked in, I can make a VLAN 2 on a second switch, and whatever ports I set to VLAN 2 on that second switch, they'll talk to these 4 ports, but that's it. So it's actually pretty cool. This is kind of fun. You can see right here. So we click on VLAN, and you can see that it automatically set itself up to be a trunk. 802.1q is a standard for trunking that's used to define how people do trunking. Okay, so anyway, so that's all set up and pretty much ready to rock and roll. So these are the basics of VLAN. The things I want you to take away from this more than anything else is VLANs take a single broadcast domain and break it up into smaller broadcast domains. Also keep in mind that you have to go into the switch somehow to configure the VLANs, and that via trunking we can propagate a single VLAN or more across multiple switches.